So each of the presenters can have 20 minutes, up to 20 minutes for their presentation, because we only have 3. And I'm very happy to say that we are being, what's the word? Live cast? Live? Yeah, so we're being live cast. And I'm not too sure where, but I'm sure some people know and are watching eagerly. So we'll start with the first presentation now. I suggest that we go through the 3 presentations, one after the other. If you have just a question of clarification at the end of a presentation, you're welcome to have it. Otherwise, I suggest that we wait for the end of the 3rd presentation by Ernesto to start the discussion. We should have comfortably an hour for question, answer, and exchanges with the room. So let's start with David. David O'Connell is a lifelong community and workplace organizer from the UK. He moved to Germany and set up a works council in a small company. He graduated from the LPG 12 in October 2016 and has just completed an internship with the ILO in Geneva. And I may add to this brief bio that he's the author of, I think, a very good piece on Corbyn and the prospects for a left alternative in the UK for the Global Labour column that I think we published in July, right?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
I recommend you read. And he's going to present today on strategic options for trade unions in organised sector of EU.
Is this working? Does this work? Hello? Okay. Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I'm not sure what you would imagine this would be about from that title. It's quite a vague title. Sorry about that. So what I was basically getting at with this paper is it feeds on quite directly from what I wrote for my master thesis, which was, of course, dealing with the issue or touching on the issue of neoliberalism. I suppose I would say from the beginning that I don't think neoliberalism is new, and I don't think it's very liberal either. It's a kind of an unusual term. What I was getting at in my master thesis was the issue of workplace cooperatives and the potential for workplace cooperatives to help revitalize the labor movement. This comes from experience in some senses, but also in interactions with people that I've met around the world. And one of the things that I've met while talking to people largely from countries like the United States or in the previously industrialized, does it work?
Microphone, please.
Is it not working?
It's working.
Oh, okay. I'm not close enough?
Closer to it, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Imagine this scenario. You're in a, let's say, previously core industry in the United States or in European Union. Oh, knocking that over. And you meet with the employers, and the employers say to you, we love working with you guys. We love this this country. We love your union. We think we're doing great work here. But listen, you've pushed the wages up so high, we can't compete in the international markets anymore. Okay, we're going to have to negotiate either cutting the wages, cutting the conditions, cutting the staff, downsizing, or if we can't find any agreement, we're going to have to move to, fill in the blank, Thailand, maybe India, Bangladesh. So the union now has a set of lose options. Either it negotiates to lose wages or conditions or something along these lines. Or if you're militant, maybe you try to call the employer's bluff and say, no, we're not negotiating cuts, we're not negotiating reductions, we're going to stand and fight. Then maybe the employer will really do it and move to Thailand, and then you lose all your membership, you lose your industrial base, and that's happening. If you look at cities like Detroit, for example, which had a population of 800,000, now down to about 300,000, they will do this. This is offshoring, right? I mean, that's one of the issues, one of the dynamics of neoliberalism today. How do you approach that problem? I suppose this was my start point when I decided to write a master thesis on the issue of cooperatives. There is actually a solution to this, potential solution, which is when you are confronted with these options, to say, well, actually, if you want to move to Thailand, go. We're going to buy the factory from you. In the past, this was done more directly through occupations, but occupations have a quite high failure rate, especially in a state with a modern infrastructure, legal infrastructure, where you will be evicted eventually. And I've been involved in factory occupations as well, and they can help you to achieve some of the short-term goals, for example, a decent redundancy package, something like that, but in the long run you won't get control of that factory. So worker buyouts, I think, is a potential mechanism for unions to maintain not only the industry that they're organizing in, but also to add a bargaining chip on the table when you're in negotiations with an employer who is threatening to offshore. As a side point, there are some unions who already have this position. One of them is in the United States, the United Steelworkers Union, also in Canada. This comes from a situation where in 1975, I believe it was, the Youngstown Steel Factory was facing this exact scenario, and the union said, we're going to buy it out. Now, one of the immediate problems with buying a steel factory is that they're very, very expensive, and most unions don't have enough resources to do that. So they needed support from the state, which they got initially from the Carter administration, but was withdrawn in the next administration, probably on the basis of, they didn't want to have a union taking over a factory and running it, as an example. So, in the case of the European Union, or in general, I didn't want to focus too much on any specific state or something like the EU, but to say, like, in the former industrial heartlands of capitalism in the West, there's not a perfect term overarching this, but in the cases where offshoring is a serious problem and the unions are faced with a lose-lose-lose situation, I do think that we can adopt a strategy of worker cooperative buyouts. There is precedent for this also in the United Kingdom, in the mining industry, which was decimated in 1985, when the miners' strikes were defeated. Their demand was for nationalization of the mining industry. That was the demand, or subsidization. When that wasn't conceded to, the interior minister, let's say, of the UK made a joke. He said, well, if the mine workers want to run the mines, they should buy them. But actually, in some places, they did it. In South Wales, in the Tower Colliery, one of the branch leaders of the National Union of Mine Workers took the redundancy pay that was given to all of the workers when they were made unemployed, took some of the finances left over from the union, and got a loan, and submitted a bid to buy out the workplace. And they achieved that bid after some struggle, and continued to operate the mine at a profit until 2008, when they ran out of coal, which is what happens in mining naturally. Now, if you imagine for a second what would have happened if this had been the plan B of the entire National Union of Mine Workers, if they had actually bought a significant portion of the mining industry from the state, or from the coal board, where would we be now? Well, we would still have a strong labor movement. I mean, questions about the coal industry aside, you can imagine another industry if you prefer. So this is my start point. What I'm intending to do in this research paper is to conduct surveys, let's say, of public attitudes towards this kind of initiative. Firstly, looking at what trade unionists think of it, just in the case of the United Kingdom. What trade unionists think if their union were to adopt a strategy of worker buyouts, and how this might affect their industrial relations when they're negotiating with an employer, and also to conduct research into what the public think of this. We have, actually, I've just noticed in the last few days here, a lot of the vehicles in New Delhi are made by Leyland, and British Leyland went out of business, I think, in the late 80s or early 90s. And this is often attributed to trade unions. I hear it as a trade unionist, even though this was while I was a child. They said, well, British Leyland went out of business. This was because of the unions. If you fight too hard, they'll just leave. Capital flight, they'll just go, okay? So this is an issue that I think needs to be addressed. And I think that if you look at the public attitudes and say, look, okay, I understand this issue, that you're worried that if we fight too hard, they'll move away. But we have a solution to that. I think that that would be quite popular. Now, I've done some preliminary research because I wanted to work out which kind of questions we should be asking in these kind of surveys. One thing I have found is that in the public sector, trade unionists in the public sector are very, very opposed to this idea in their sector. And I think that makes sense. I mean, if you're working in a state-run hospital, why would you want it to be turned into a private cooperative? I get that point. So I'm more looking at those sectors of the economy which are more vulnerable to offshoring. And this could be, I know initially the paper said European Union, but it could basically be, it depends where this would be best placed, but I'm looking at, as I say, the former industrial heartlands of industrial capitalism. I suppose there's going to be a lot of questions about how this would relate to the global south. I think that those are important questions. I don't know how to answer them directly, but I've enjoyed so far already talking about this issue and how that might affect it. Of course, that would be important too. And in India, you have lots of good examples of worker cooperatives, I think. Largely startups rather than buyouts. While I was working in the ILO, I spoke to the cooperative department quite a lot. There is actually a recommendation on this issue, not a convention, but a 193, which says very clearly that in the case of insolvency, when a company goes out of business, and the workers submit a bid to run the business, the government should provide support to them and prefer that bid over other private bids. What I'm looking at now is discussing actually also the steel industry, which I think maybe would be better left for the questions period, but I would like you to keep it in mind perhaps, because I think this is one of these points where it could become emblematic of the situation, where you have now these large mergers in the steel industry, which are now pushing people out of work in the UK. There's going to be, in the next couple of years, mass redundancies, also in Germany and in other countries, I'm sure. But in Germany, where I live, and the UK, where I'm from, I've heard more about it. The question is if those jobs are being lost or if they're being transposed somewhere else. There is still potential for the workers to buy out the steel factories in the UK. And this was even proposed by a former minister as a solution to the problem. But the unions, for example, are not even thinking about these kind of things. They're quite hostile to the idea. They have, in the UK at least, a very standard script, which is we want it nationalised, which is understandable. But when that's not possible, they have nothing else. And I also want to just comment that this is the issue of nationalisation or subsidisation within the context of the European Union is an issue, because the European Union started off as the European Coal and Steel Community and has very strict rules about the steel industry and about how it should be regulated or financed, and very strict laws against subsidizing the steel industry in terms of nationalization or something like this. So in industries like that, we have more of a chance of worker buyouts if we can get support from those places which would fund it. So I wanted to talk more about the issues rather than the technicalities of the paper. I don't know if that would interest you very much, but effectively, as I say, it will be a process of judging public opinions on this subject, and also the issue of perspective of trade union activists and trade union members in those industries. And I think I will probably focus specifically on the steel industry for the reasons I just mentioned. But in the question and answer, it'd be great to hear your input on what you think about that as a strategy in general, and also how you think it would affect the industrial situation in other countries outside of the former heartlands. Okay. I rambled a bit, but I think I got my point across.
You did.
Wonderful. Okay.
How
much time did I take?
Not much. You took about 12 minutes.
12, okay. I was planning for 15, so... All right. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, David. We're now going to show a presentation by Radhika Krishnan. Radhika is an assistant professor at the Department of Humanities in the International Institute of Information Technology in Hyderabad in India. She's an engineer by training and has a long interest in issues related to environment, technology, and labor. More specifically, she is interested in studying the interface between industry, ecology, and society. And she has a PhD from GNU, and I think what she'll be which she explores the interventions of Shankar Neoliberalism in trade business, and what she's going to present today draws on her PhD research. The title of her paper is Negotiating Resource Control and Ethnicity in Central India, Issues of Identity, Nationality and Statehood in Imaginations of the Chhattisgarh Mukti Morcha. Which I probably mispronounced, and I apologize for this. Over to you.
Thank you. Let me begin with a few caveats. To begin with, an apology. You will have to deal with the disembodied voice thanks to my height. Apologies for that. Well, I'm so happy, David, that you presented before me, because you've actually sort of laid out the ground for what I'm trying to do here. Incidentally, the small union that I'll be talking about today, which is the Chhattisgarh Mukti Morcha, literally it is, this is a word in Hindi, but the translation is Chhattisgarh Liberation Front. And Chhattisgarh is a small region in central India, to give some context. And one of the many things that the CMM, the Chhattisgarh Mukti Morcha, did was in fact to run a cooperative in iron ore mining. So that actually fits in pretty nicely with what you were talking about. But unfortunately, my paper today is not looking at that